On a raw, bright morning in the last week of March, 1902, 11 wagon loads of grubbed hedge brush were tipped into the lane of a widow named Hulda Prine, and the man who ordered it done sat his buggy at the head of that lane in a good gray overcoat with his thumbs hooked in his vest, and made certain that every soul traveling the Dry Fork Road that morning saw it go over the tailboards. Grubbed hedge brush, if you have never had the handling of it, is not brush the way a willow thicket is brush. It is Osage orange, which the old people in that country call bois d'arc, a wood so hard it will turn the edge of a good axe, and so armed with thorn that one branch dragged careless across a man's forearm will open it in 4 places at once. What comes off the top of a grubbed hedge row is a mountain of green thorn that will not burn while it is wet, will not rot in 10 years, will not pass through a mower, and cannot be left lying anywhere a horse might walk. Hedge brush was the leavings of progress, and it was the one commodity in that county in the spring of 1902 that was absolutely free, for the plain reason that every man who had any of it wanted it gone before planting. Dorsey Kilgore had more of it than any man on the Dry Fork, because he had made a business out of making it. He was 48 years old that spring. A big man through the chest with a full ruddy face and a sandy mustache he kept trimmed at the barber shop in Senate, and he farmed 640 acres of the best black ground in the township, and he was besides the district agent for a barbed wire concern up at Joliet, which meant that every rod of hedge that came out of Kettle County ground put money in his pocket twice over, once for the grubbing contract and once again for the wire that went up in its place. In 3 seasons his crews had taken out better than 11 miles of hedge row, and in the ordinary way of things he hauled the brush back to a gully on his own North 80 and let it gray out there. That March he did not. He sent it down the Dry Fork Road instead, 11 loads of it behind 4 teams, and he had his men back the wagons to the low gate at the bottom of the hollow where Hulda Prine lived alone, and tipped the whole of it into her lane until there was a barricade of thorn standing there higher than the gate itself and 40 feet long, and he said, in the hearing of at least 9 men who repeated it before supper, that since the widow was so uncommon fond of hedge, she was welcome to his as well. She came out while the 4th load was going over. She was a short, stout, plain woman of 63, thick through the shoulders from a lifetime of lifting, with a broad sun, darkened face, lined like a walnut hull, small, deep-set, hazel eyes, and a thin, straight mouth that did not travel far in either direction, and she was wearing what she wore nearly every day of her life: a patched dark blue wool skirt down to the ankle, a faded rust-red jacket bodice buttoned to the throat, a coarse gray apron, and a pair of heavy leather gauntlet gloves scarred all over from the thorns. She stood at her own gatepost with her hands folded into her apron, and she watched the 7th load and the 8th and the 9th go over, and she did not shout, and she did not weep, and she did not send anybody after the constable, and when the last team was swinging around in the road, she walked up to the buggy where Dorsey Kilgore sat, and she looked a long moment at that heap of thorn. And then she said 2 words that went around Kettle County a good deal faster than the joke ever did. She said, "Much obliged." 11 weeks later, in the last 9 days of June, the Colorado potato beetle came through that township in numbers no living man there had ever seen, and it took the potato crop off of Kettle County the way a fire takes a hayfield. Better than 900 acres stripped to bare brown stems while the poison was sold out and the rain washed off what little there was. On the 25th of June, inside a square of that same laughed-at hedge, 11 acres of potatoes stood dark green, knee-high, and in full white bloom, without one bare stem in the whole of it, and they were the only potatoes left standing in the county. On the 4th of November, a buyer from Indianapolis stood on the loading platform at the Senate depot with 3 boxcars behind him and read the settlement out loud off a barrel head so the tally clerk could hear it, and the figure he read was $4,180. That is the end of it. Here is how it got there. Before wire, there was Hedge. When the first settlers broke that country in the 1850s, there was no timber to spare for rail fence, so they planted Osage orange in a furrow a foot apart, and in 5 years a properly tended hedgerow was what the old advertisements promised. Horse high, bull strong, and hog tight. Then came wire. Wire went up in a day, took a fence row 6 inches wide, never had to be cut back with a billhook in July heat, and did not shade the crop, and that argument finished the hedge. It was a fair argument, too, because a hedge row 16 feet through takes 16 feet of ground out of production for as far as it runs and robs the crop for 20 feet on either side besides. Between 1894 and the spring of 1902, the men of Kettle County pulled out better than 212 miles of hedgerow and put wire up in its place, and gained back by their own reckoning near onto 400 acres of tillable ground. Every farm on the Dry Fork Road did it. Every farm but one. Huldah Prine had 160 acres at the bottom of the hollow where the Dry Fork slows and spreads, ground her husband's father had broken in 1868. And the old man had laid it out in the fashion of his own boyhood, in small fields, 19 of them, not one above 11 acres, every field bounded by hedge. With hedge along the road frontage, and hedge down both sides of the lane, and hedge on the 2 ditch banks besides. When the county surveyor, a careful old fellow named Ames, went over it in '98 for a drainage petition, he stepped the whole of it off and wrote in his book that the Prine place carried 9 miles and 40 rods of standing hedge row. That is the number this whole story hangs on. 9 miles of thorn on a farm a man could walk across in 20 minutes. Ames did the other piece of arithmetic, too, because everybody in the office wanted him to. 16.5 feet of ground under 9 miles and 40 rods comes to 17 acres and a half. Good Black Bottom in that township was selling that year at $40 the acre. So the joke on Huldah Prine, before it was ever a joke about brushing a lane, was a joke about money. And it was told in exactly those terms at the elevator and the church door and in the back of Rady's store. The widow Prine is paying taxes every year on $700 worth of ground that grows nothing on God's earth but thorn, and she will not let a man near it with a chain. Her husband, Ovid Prine, had died in the spring of 1893, and after that she farmed the place herself with hired help at the busy ends of the year, and she was known as a hard, close, quiet woman who paid cash and did not borrow and did not visit much. She had been asked about the hedge more times than she could count, politely, by the county agent, twice in writing by a land company out of Terre Haute, and at last by Dorsey Kilgore himself, who came down her lane in the fall of 1901 with a printed contract in his coat and offered to Grub the whole 9 miles for nothing. Not 1 cent, if she would sign over the butts and the posts, which he calculated at some 3,000 fence posts and better than 100 cords of, the hardest firewood in Indiana. It was by any ordinary measure a generous offer, and it would have handed her back 17.5 acres of the best ground on the place. She read it through twice on her own doorstep, handed it back, and said no. And when he asked her why, standing there in her dooryard with his derby in his hand, she gave him the answer the whole county was still laughing about 5 months later when he dumped his thorn in her lane. She said, "I am not keeping fence, Mr. Kilgore, I am keeping birds." Nobody knew what to do with a sentence like that, so the county turned it into the punchline of the joke instead of the answer to the question. There is a woman down on the Dry Fork paying $700 ground rent to a lot of sparrows. What Huldah Prine did with the brush is the part nobody expected and the part that ought to have warned them. She did not burn it, and she did not haul it off, and she did not go to law. Starting the first week of April, in the mornings before the ground was fit to work, she went at that heap with a hand axe and a hay rope, and she cut the worst of the thorn into lengths a person could carry. And she bound the lengths into bundles as thick through as a barrel, and she roped each bundle across her own chest and shoulders and carried it on her back up the lane and out along the hedge rows to wherever there was a thin place. A hedge goes gappy at the bottom as it ages, and the old hedgers had a name for the cure, which was dead hedging. And the cure was this, that you weave the cut thorn into the living hedge low down and stake it, and let the live growth come up through it. It fills the gap in 1 season and rots away in 5, by which time the live wood has closed. She had been doing it in a small way with her own trimmings for 25 years. Now she had 11 wagon loads of it delivered free to her own gate. A man named Ansel Teague, who farmed the 80 just north of her and was then a young fellow of 26 with a new wife and a mortgage, told it afterward that he came over the rise on the Dry Fork Road one morning in the middle of April and saw the widow coming up her lane bent almost double under a bundle of thorn brush bigger than she was. Roped across her body so that it hung down past her knees and out past both her elbows, and he stopped the team and watched her go the whole length of that lane without setting it down once, and he said he was ashamed of himself for a week and could not have told anybody exactly why. By the last of May, the heap in the lane was gone. It had all walked out to the hedge rows on the back of a 63-year-old woman, 1 bundle at a time, and it was staked and woven low into 9 miles of thorn, and the hedge that spring was thicker at the ground than it had been in 10 years. She planted 11 acres of potatoes that April in the 2 long fields on the south side of the lane, which was what she planted every year, along with wheat and oats and hay and a little rye, because potatoes were the one crop in that country that a woman farming with hired help could turn into cash money without a barn full of stock, and because the bottom ground in the hollow was a loose black loam that grew them clean and shapely. She planted an old sort called Early Rose in the smaller field and a late keeper called Rural New Yorker in the bigger, and she cut her own seed, and she had her rows running east and west so the sun came down them. And the 2 fields together sat inside a square of hedge on all 4 sides, with the lane hedge on the north and the road hedge on the west. That is where the crop was standing when the beetles came. The beetles came the 2nd week of June. The Colorado potato beetle is a hard-shelled insect about the size of the nail on your little finger, yellow with 10 black stripes down the wing covers, and it lays clusters of orange eggs on the underside of a potato leaf, and the grub that hatches is the real destroyer, a soft, humped, brick-red thing with 2 rows of black dots along its sides that eats without stopping from the hour it hatches. It had come east out of the Rocky Mountain country in the 1860s and reached Indiana in the 70s, and by the 90s every farmer in the Middle West had a way of dealing with it, and the way was Paris green, an arsenic powder mixed with lime and dusted on or sprinkled from a can. 3 or 4 applications through the season, $1.25 for a 5-pound tin at Rady's store in Senate. In an ordinary year, that was the whole of it, a nuisance and a chore and an expense, and no man lost his crop to it. 1902 was not an ordinary year. The winter before had been the mildest in 18 years, so mild that the ground at Senate never froze below 4 inches, and the beetles that had gone down into the fence rows and the trash in October came through it almost to a 1, where an ordinary winter kills better than half. The spring was early and warm, and the first brood was out and laying 3 weeks ahead of the calendar, which meant there was time in the season for a 3rd brood where there was normally room for 2. And the county had done one other thing, without knowing it was doing anything at all. It had spent 8 years pulling out 212 miles of hedgerow. By the 11th of June, the beetles were on every potato field in Kettle County in numbers no living man there had seen. Ansel Teague said that on his own 6 acres you could stand at the end of a row in the evening and hear them. A fine dry rustling like light rain on a straw stack, which was the sound of the feeding. They were on the vines so thick the leaves looked orange from a distance. They crossed the road in front of a buggy in a moving band a yard wide. They got into the wells and the water buckets and the wash on the line. Men went at them the only way they knew, and for 4 days there was Paris green going on to potato ground all over that township, and then 2 things happened at once. Rady's store sold the last 5-pound tin of Paris green on the morning of the 13th of June to a man from over on Coon Ridge who paid $4 for it, and the wholesale drug house in Indianapolis wired back that they were cleaned out and their next lot was 10 days off, because the whole state was ordering at once. And on the night of the 14th of June it commenced to rain, and it rained off and on for 4 days, 3.5 inches in all, and every particle of poison that had been laid on that county went into the ground with it. After the rain came 4 days of hot, bright weather, and in those 4 days the third brood hatched into fields that had nothing on them at all. It took 9 days from the 16th of June to the 25th. That is how long it took to take the potato crop off of Kettle County, Indiana. What was left in the fields at the end of it was not a damaged crop. It was a bare crop, brown stems standing 18 inches high with a few ribs of leaf hanging on them like the ribs of an umbrella after a wind. And underneath in the ground, the tubers stopped where they were, the size of a hen's egg and hollow-hearted, because a potato does not grow from the ground, it grows from the leaf, and there was no leaf. Men who had been farming 40 years stood in their fields with their hats in their hands. The county had put in something better than 900 acres of potatoes that spring. On the 25th of June, Ansel Teague drove down the Dry Fork Road on his way to Senate to see whether anybody had poison, and he came around the bend at the bottom of the hollow where the pine hedge runs along the west side of the road, and he looked through a gate gap, and he pulled his team up so short that the neck yoke banged. Inside that square of hedge, 11 acres of potatoes stood dark green and unbroken and knee-high and in full white bloom, without one bare stem in the whole of it. He got down and left his team standing in the road and walked in through the gate gap, which is a thing no man in that country did on another person's ground without being asked. And he went down between 2 rows, turning over leaf after leaf, looking for the orange eggs. And he told it afterward that he went the length of 11 acres and back and found beetles, certainly. But he found them in 1s and 2s, a grub here and a hard shell there, the way you would in a fair year in July. And he found something he had no word for at the time. He found the underside of leaf after leaf, where the eggs had plainly been laid and were plainly gone. A little dried yellow scar, and nothing on it. Huldah Prine was at the far end of the field on her knees, with a hoe laid down beside her, doing what she had been doing for 2 weeks, which was going up and down 11 acres by hand and taking off what the birds had missed, and dropping them into a tin lard bucket with an inch of coal oil in the bottom. And Ansel Teague came up to her and took off his hat and asked her straight out how much. Poison she had used. She said none. She said she had not bought a tin of Paris green in 9 years and did not intend to, that arsenic burned the vine and got into the ground and killed the toads, and that she had not needed it. He asked her what she had done then, and she stood up off her knees the slow way a stout woman of 63 stands up, and she put the bucket down. And she pointed with her chin at the wall of thorn running along the west side of that field, 20 feet high and 16 feet through and blacker green than the potatoes, and she said, "I told Mr. Kilgore." He thought it was a joke. It got out of the hollow that same evening, and by the Sunday there were 11 rigs pulled up along the Dry Fork Road with their teams tied to her hedge, and men standing 3 deep at the gate gap looking in at 11 acres of green in a county that had gone brown. And by the middle of the week it had reached the courthouse at Senate, and the editor of the Kettle County Register had driven out, and stood in the road and gone back and set 2 columns about it under a heading that called it a remarkable exemption. And what happened next is the part people forget when they tell it, because they like the tidy shape of it better without this part in. Nobody believed her. The explanations went around that county in the order explanations always go, from the ones that cost nothing to admit to the ones that cost something. It was the ground, damper and cooler down in that hollow, and the beetle would not work it. It was the seed, some old sort with a tough leaf. It was the timing. It was luck, plain and simple, and there was no more to be said. And then, when the ground was proven to be the same black loam that lay under 2,000 acres of that township, and the seed was proven to be early rose and rural New Yorker, which half the county was also growing, and the planting date was proven ordinary, the explanations turned the way they do, and got personal. Dorsey Kilgore did not start that, and did not have to. He only stood in the door of Rady's store on the second Saturday in July with his thumbs in his vest in front of 11 or 12 men who had just lost their potato money for the year, and said what a good many of them wanted to hear. He said that he had known Huldah Prine's husband, and that Ovid Prine had been a straight man, and that in his own opinion the widow had got hold of a quantity of Paris grain early in the spring before the run on it, and had it in her smokehouse the whole time the rest of the county was going without and paying $4 a tin, and had used it, and was now telling a story about sparrows because the truth of it would not sit well with her neighbors. He said it in a reasonable, regretful voice, and he was the biggest farmer in the township and the man who sold them their wire, and it stuck. For about 11 days, on the Dry Fork Road, the widow Prine was not a marvel. She was a liar and a hoarder. The man who ended that, and who is the reason we have any numbers at all to put in this account, was a professor of entomology from the Agricultural College at Lafayette named Erasmus Tolliver, a thin, stooped, near-sighted man of 60 in a shiny black sack suit who came down on the accommodation train on the 22nd of July with a canvas satchel, 2 collecting nets, a folding stool, and a notebook, because the Register had sent its 2 columns to 3 papers, and one of them had. Reached his department. He asked her leave to work on the place for a week. She gave it, and asked him one thing in return, which was that he was not to shoot anything on her ground, no matter what science required, and he agreed, and afterward said in print that the restriction had made his work better instead of worse. What Tolliver did over the next 6 days was tedious and unglamorous, and is the whole hinge of this story. He measured the hedge and found it, as Ames had, 16.5 feet through at the base and standing better than 20 feet high, and he found the thing that mattered, which was that it was thick clear to the ground, thick enough that a man could not see daylight through it lying on his belly, because it had been laid and staked and dead-hedged for 40 years instead of being trimmed on top and let go leggy underneath. He counted nests. He counted them in a measured mile of the west hedge, going both faces, and in that 1 mile he found and recorded 231 occupied nests of 19 different sorts of bird. He counted brown thrashers and catbirds and cardinals and song sparrows and field sparrows and indigo buntings and yellow-breasted chats and house wrens, and 11 pairs of bob-white quail nesting in the grass at the hedge foot where the mowing machine could never go, and 2 pairs of yellow-billed cuckoos, and a kingbird on a dead top, and most to the purpose, 9 pairs of rose-breasted grosbeaks. He then did what nobody in Kettle County had thought to do, which was to sit still and watch. He set his folding stool at the edge of the potato field in the shade of the hedge before sunup on the 24th of July, and he watched a single pair of rose-breasted grosbeaks with young in the nest, and he wrote down every trip they made out into the rows and back, and what they were carrying when they came back, from 4 minutes after 4 in the morning until noon. In that time the pair made 91 trips into the potatoes. 87 of the 91 came back with the grubs of the Colorado potato beetle in the bill, most often several at a time. He engaged Ansel Teague's younger brother, a boy of 11, to do the same watch on a second nest for 2 days at 15 cents a day, and the boy's tally, which the professor printed later in full because he said it was as good as his own, came out at 104 trips in 1 morning. Then he did the thing that turned the whole county over, and he did it in the plainest way imaginable. He drove out to Dorsey Kilgore's 640 acres and asked leave to walk a measured mile of fence line there, and Kilgore gave it gladly, because at that point he thought the professor was going to prove the ground theory. Tolliver walked a measured mile of new wire fence on the north 80, 3 strands on locust posts, with the fence row disked clean to the wire on both sides the way a careful farmer keeps it, and he counted nests. He found 3. 1 meadowlark and 1 dickcissel in the grass of the road ditch, and a killdeer scrape on a bare headland, and every one of the 3 was a ground nest that a mowing machine would take out before the young flew. 3 nests in a mile of wire, 231 in a mile of hedge. On the evening of the 18th of August, Professor Erasmus Tolliver gave a talk at the Senate Schoolhouse that had been advertised for a week in the Register. And the room, which held about 90, had upwards of 200 people in it and around it, standing in the aisles and sitting in the open windows and crowded on the steps with the door propped. He was not a good speaker. He read from his notebook in a dry voice and lost his place twice. It did not matter, because he had the numbers, and he laid them down one after another like a man dealing cards. He said that on the Pine place he had recorded, in 1 measured mile, 231 occupied nests of 19 species, and that on the whole 9 miles and 40 rods of that hedge, if the mile he counted was anywhere near typical, there were something in the neighborhood of 2,079 nests, holding at the end of July better than 7,000 nestlings, every one of which had to be fed from daylight to dark on soft-bodied insects taken within a few hundred yards of the nest. Because a grosbeak with young will not fly a mile for a grub when there is a field of them at the end of the hedge. He said that the pair he had watched had made 91 trips in 8 hours and had come back with potato grubs on 87 of them, and that the boys' pair had made 104 in one morning. He said that the 11 pairs of quail he had found nesting at the hedge foot would each of them, adults and brood together, take a quantity of hard-shelled beetles off the ground through the season that he did not care to estimate in public because the figure would not be believed. And then he said the other thing, and the room got very quiet. He said that Kettle County had removed 212 miles of hedgerow in 8 years. He said that at the rate he had actually counted, and allowing generously for hedge that was not so well kept as the pine hedge, those 212 miles had been carrying somewhere between 30 and 40,000 nesting pairs of insect-eating birds, and that the county had taken all of them off the land in 8 years and put up in their place a wire fence 6 inches wide that would hold 3 nests to the mile, and that the county had done it without once writing the birds down in the column of what the hedge was worth. He said, and this was printed afterward and quoted for 30 years in extension bulletins across 4 states, that a hedgerow is not a fence with birds in it. It is a bird pasture that happens to turn stock. Nobody laughed. Dorsey Kilgory was sitting in the 3rd row from the back with his hat on his knee, and before Tolliver had finished he was asked from the floor by a man named Simeon Rady, who kept the store and had a ledger under his arm, whether he still held to what he had said in Rady's doorway in July. Rady then opened the ledger on the desk at the front and read out that Hulda Prine's account at his store showed no purchase of Paris green, arsenic, London purple, or any other insecticide since the 9th of May, 1893, which was 6 weeks after her husband died, and that on that date she had bought 1 5-pound tin and had brought it back unopened in September of the same year for credit. The professor added, in his flat way, that in any event a field sprayed with Paris green in June carries a visible burn on the leaf margin into August, and that he had examined several hundred vines on the Prane place, and there was no burn on any of them. Kilgory left before the questions were over. He did not say anything on his way out, and the men he passed did not say anything to him, and that silence, by every account that survives, was worse for him than shouting would have been. She dug the crop in the first week of October. It took 9 days with 3 hired men, a plow, and every basket and sack on the place, and half the neighborhood came down at one time or another to look at it, and a good many stayed and worked and would not take pay. What came out of those 11 acres was 2,040 bushels of potatoes, sound, clean-skinned, and full-sized, which is a yield that would have been a fine yield in any year at all and was an unheard-of thing in that one. The rest of Kettle County, out of better than 900 acres planted, dug something under 4,000 bushels altogether, and most of that was small stuff fit for stock. The price did the rest. Potatoes that had brought 50 cents the bushel in the fall of 1901 were at $1.40 in Indianapolis by the middle of October, and that was for eating stock. Hulda Prane did not sell eating stock. She had 2,040 bushels of clean, unpoisoned, full-size tubers out of vines that had never lost their leaf, off a farm that the state entomologist had just spent a week on and written up, and there was not a potato grower in the state of Indiana who was not going to need seed in the spring of 1903, because the crop that ordinarily became next year's seed had been eaten in the field in June. A produce and seed house in Indianapolis sent a buyer named Harlan Roop down on the train on the 20th of October. A tidy man in a checked overcoat who walked the field and cut open 40 tubers at random with a pocket knife and looked at the flesh, and who then sat on an upturned crate in her lane and made an offer, and she turned it down, and he made another, and they settled at $2.20 the bushel for seed stock delivered to the platform at Senate. She held back 140 bushels for her own seed and her own table and for 2 families on the Dry Fork Road who had lost everything they planted. She sold 1,900 bushels. On the 4th of November, 1902, on the loading platform of the Senate depot, with 3 loaded boxcars behind him and a crowd of perhaps 60 people standing in the cold because word had got around what hour the settlement would be made, Harlan Roop put his book on a barrel head and read out the figure aloud so the tally clerk could hear it. And what he read out was $4,180. It is worth saying what that sum was in that place in that year, because a figure without a measure beside it is only a noise. A good hired man on the Dry Fork Road in 1902 was paid $22 a month and his board, which came to $264 for a year of work. A new top buggy cost $65. The whole Prine place, 160 acres of black bottom, would have sold that autumn for something near $6,400. In an ordinary year, Huldah Prine cleared somewhere between $500 and $700 off the farm, and there were years she cleared less. And the 17 acres and a half that the whole county had spent 8 years laughing at, the ground that grew nothing on God's earth but thorn, the $700 worth of idle dirt she was paying taxes on for nothing, had just returned $4,180 in a single season. Not over 40 years. In one season, off one crop on 11 acres of the 160. 6 times the market value of the ground it supposedly wasted. That was the arithmetic, and once it was written down in that form, which is the form Simeon Rady wrote it in on a piece of butcher paper and pinned up in his store window in November, where it stayed until the following March. There was nothing left in Kettle County to argue about. She did not buy anything with it. That surprised people and disappointed a few, because a story like that is supposed to end in a new house or a piano. She paid her taxes, and she paid her 3 hired men a bonus of $11 apiece, and she put $4,000 in the Senate bank, and then in the middle of February, 1903, she did the thing that makes her worth a story 120 years later. She wrote to a nursery firm at Quincy, Illinois, and ordered 12,000 Osage orange seedlings, 2-year whips, and had them shipped in bundles on the cars, and she had them heeled in behind her smokehouse by the middle of March. And she put a notice in the Kettle County Register that she would sell them at what they cost her, $4 the thousand, to any farmer in the county who would put his name to a paper saying he would set them on a field line and let her show him how to lay them. That was the whole condition. Not money, the laying, because the thing that made her hedge different from the ragged half-dead hedge still standing on farms where they had simply quit trimming it was that hers was thick at the ground. And a hedge is only thick at the ground if somebody takes a billhook to it every 7th winter and cuts the stems 3/4 through near the base and bends them over living and weaves them along a line of stakes, and lets the sap keep running through the hinge. That is called laying, and it is a craft, and her father had learned it as a boy in Warwickshire, where his people had been hedgers longer than anybody had bothered to write down. And he had put a billhook in her hands when she was 9 years old and made her do a rod of it every winter afternoon until she could do it in her sleep, and she was the last person in Kettle County who knew how. So that winter and the next and the one after that, a stout woman past 60 stood out in other people's fields in January with a billhook and a bundle of stakes and taught men 30 years younger than herself how to cut a stem so it would bend and not break. 14 farms took her up on it the first year. 31 the second. By 1910 there were better than 19 miles of new hedgerow set out on the field lines of that county, most of it from her seedlings, and the county agent had put the laying of it into the Winter Institute program, and Purdue had printed Professor Tolliver's bulletin under the title of the hedgerow as a check upon insect injury, in which the pine hedge in Kettle County is named 11 times and the widow herself is named once, in a footnote, as having declined to permit collecting on her premises, a restriction the author says improved the work. Dorsey Kilgore's wire business in that county was finished by the summer of 1903. Nobody said a word to him about it, and nobody cut him in the street, and that was rather the trouble. Men simply stopped signing grubbing contracts, his 2 crews were let go in June, and the Joliet concern moved his agency to a man over at Coon Ridge the following spring on account of the falling off in orders. He kept his 640 acres and farmed them, and was never a poor man. But in the middle of April, 1903, he drove his buggy down the Dry Fork Road and turned in at the low gate at the bottom of the hollow in the same lane where he had dumped 11 wagon loads of thorn 13 months before, and he asked the widow, Prine, if she had seed potatoes to sell. She had. She sold him 11 bushels at $2.20 the bushel, which was exactly what she had charged the Indianapolis house and exactly what she charged everybody, and she wrote him a receipt in pencil and gave him his change, and she did not say one word about the previous spring, then or ever, in the hearing of any person who left a record of it. And when he had the sacks in the buggy, he stood there with his derby in his hands a minute and asked whether she had any of those hedge plants left. She said she had about 900. He bought them all, and he paid her $4 the thousand, and he set them that same month along the north line of the 80, where the professor had counted 3 nests in a measured mile. And he sent for her in the winter of 1906 to come and show him how to lay them, and she came, and she stayed all one cold day and would not take $1 for it, and that is as near to an apology as anybody ever got out of either of them. Ansel Teague set Hedge on all 4 sides of his 80 and never planted potatoes again without it. His younger brother, the boy who sat on a stool at 15 cents a day and tallied 104 trips in one morning, went to the agricultural college at Lafayette on that arithmetic and spent 31 years with the Biological Survey counting what birds eat, and he told this story in a lecture hall in 1944 to a room full of young men who had never seen a hedgerow. And he said that everything he knew he had learned from a 63-year-old woman who would not let anybody shoot on her ground. Huldah Prine farmed the place herself until she was 81 and lived on it until she died in February of 1927, aged 88, and the notice in the register said only that she was a lifelong resident and a good neighbor and had never been known to raise her voice. When the farm was surveyed for the estate that spring, the surveyor measured the standing hedge row on it at 9 miles and 36 rods, 4 rods less than Ames had found in 1898, and the 4 rods had gone to a widened road cut and not to a chain. It is still there, not all of it, and not as thick as she kept it, because nobody has laid it properly since the Second War. But if you drive that hollow in western Indiana in the last week of April, you will come around the bend and find both sides of the road walled in dark thorn 20 feet high and full of birds, and you will pass along it for the better part of a mile without knowing that you are looking at the thing an entire county once paid good money to destroy. Or that a woman in a rust-red jacket carried 11 wagon loads of somebody else's garbage up that lane on her own back, 1 bundle at a time, to make it thicker. She was not wasting 17 acres. She was the only person in Kettle County who had bothered to ask what they were for.